I think almost everyone signed in. Thank you so much for being here this evening. This meeting is being conducted by the City of Los Angeles for sea level rise planning, which is being conducted as part of the local coastal program update. And planning for sea level rise is a new component for local coastal program updates. And in our state, California has recognized that sea levels have started to rise and will continue to rise. And so we really have this opportunity right now to use science, examine data, and put planning programs into place for communities like Venice to increase resiliency in the long term. So we're really at this point where we can be proactive. And so thank you for all of you for being here to be part of that process. I want to make some introductions. I'm sorry, I've got too many things in my hand. So let me first introduce some key members of the city's Venice Local Coastal Program update team, and especially those who are involved in sea level rise planning. We have Jonathan Hershey, and if you can let us know, he's in the back, working hard. Say hi, Jonathan. Also, a key for leading the team is Hagu Solomon-Carey and Helen Campbell. And then we have many other from this city here. You'll meet them as well. If you could just raise your hands. Thank you. From the consultant team, we have 3 consultants who are supporting the city in this effort. They are Dudek, Moffitt and Nickel, and Kearns West. And maybe we can all raise our hands. And you'll get a chance to meet the consultant team members later on in the meeting tonight. My name's Joan Isaacson. I am with Kearns West, and we're a firm that focuses on public involvement for projects like this one. And my role here is facilitator. And really my role as facilitator is to make sure that everyone who is here at this meeting gets a chance to participate in an equal way and in a way that's comfortable for them. So that's what my role is here. So we'll go to the next slide. And the purpose of this workshop this evening, as you can see, is to share conclusions of the vulnerability assessment. And that might be a new term to you, so we're going to talk about what that is in just a few moments. And then especially important is we are providing opportunities at this meeting for community members to ask a lot of questions, and because you're probably going to see some things in the presentation that you want to know more about. And so what we're going to be doing is going into small groups after the presentation where you will have access to project team members, and we'll be able to have one-on-one conversations, and you'll get a chance to ask many more of your questions in those small group settings like that. So this is a slide that overviews the format for this evening. So you can see we're going to have a presentation first on the vulnerability assessment. What is it? How is it conducted? What are the conclusions? And then we'll also, in that, weave in some examples of adaptation concepts. And then we'll do the round robin small groups, as I mentioned just a moment ago. So what's going to happen is you're going to go to a group, and the project team is going to circulate. So you get to get comfortable in your group, and then the project team will just go from group to group. So you'll get a chance to participate in the Q&A and all of the discussions. And then we'll wrap up. Now, how many of you were at the November workshop? We had a workshop in November. And the summary of that is online. And just to give you a recap of what we did, because we're building off of what we heard from the community at that November workshop. So we had open house stations where we were providing information about what is sea level rise, and how does adaptation planning and the LCP fit into sea level rise planning. And then we had small group discussions. And the purpose of those discussions was to get input from the community about what you thought would be important to address and study in the vulnerability assessment. So that input was considered by the team as they were preparing the vulnerability assessment. Some what we did in the summary for the workshop is we synthesized some themes from the input, and just to give you an idea of the types of input we heard about what community members thought should be studied in the vulnerability assessment. We heard about canal hazards and beach area hazards, the importance of community involvement, and making sure that community members have this important information and have input on the adaptation strategies. There was, of course, discussion about flooding, coastal flooding, flooding more inland. And we heard comments about making sure to study habitat at the beach and in the canal areas. Some discussion about infrastructure, the importance of protecting housing as sea level rises, as well as making sure to consider the unique community and character and history in Venice. So that gives you a snapshot, kind of a sampling of what we heard in November and what we're building off of in the vulnerability assessment. So before we start the presentation, I just want to make a few notes about environmental justice in the Coastal Act. So in 2016, Governor Brown signed Assembly Bill 2616, which amended the California Coastal Act, and that the new language gives the California Coastal Commission new authority to specifically consider environmental justice when making decisions about coastal development permits. The bill also added a definition of environmental justice to the Coastal Act. And this is another important part of this is the Coastal Commission has identified sea level adaptation projects as an area where environmental justice issues could be raised. And also, importantly, disadvantaged communities may have more difficulty preparing for and responding to flooding that could result from sea level rise. The Commission staff are currently developing specific policy guidance for local cities on how to address environmental justice concerns as it relates to sea level rise. While everyone's waiting for the new guidance, the city is being proactive and taking the opportunity to address environmental justice issues in the Venice-specific vulnerability assessment. So I want to just give you a little bit more information about that. And as you can see on this slide, when we use the term social vulnerability, we're referring to socioeconomic implications of sea level rise hazards and adaptation strategies. And another important note to keep in mind is that all asset vulnerabilities and adaptation options have the potential for socioeconomic implications. This is an interesting map. So this map shows the social vulnerability index as applied to Venice. And this is based on 32 variables. And the darker areas are those areas where there are communities with greater social vulnerabilities. So in Venice, you can see that they're located north here in this area of Abbot Kinney. And kind of like make a snapshot of this in mind, because when you see the maps that show the vulnerability assessment, you're going to see that the impacts are more in this area. And so while the areas in the community that may be the most vulnerable, they may not be directly impacted by flooding and sea level rise itself, but there could be implications of sea level rise in terms of how it affects infrastructure or transportation or public services or the schools that could affect the more socially vulnerable communities.
Excuse me, could you identify the main streets there?
Yes. So this is Abbot Kinney right here, and this is Venice, Lincoln, and Rose.
just to your right, right, no, just to the right back.
Right?
Just diagonally down.
This.
Yeah. Oh, the one just to its left.
Is that California?
In the border. That.
Oh, okay.
That's probably California.
It's probably California.
Okay.
So one more slide, then I'm going to hand it over to Moffett and Nickel for the meat and potatoes of the presentation. But some questions related to social vulnerability in the planning process are listed on this slide. So these are, we wanted to put these up front so that you can be thinking about these as you're hearing the information about the vulnerability assessment. So one question is, how do the dynamic issues of gentrification, rent displacement, and population growth affect Venice's vulnerability to sea level rise? How might tide gate failure, flood insurance, storm-related coastal flooding, and other sea level rise issues affect displacement or community makeup? And how will vulnerable populations be impacted by hazards and potential adaptation strategies? So these are big questions. They're important questions. They're questions that the project team will start looking at. And you'll receive an input card later, and there's a place where you can write your thoughts related to these questions. So we just want to make sure to flag them for you up front. And next, I will ask Aaron Holloway if he'll lead us to the presentation.
Thank you, Joan. Good evening. My name is Aaron Holloway. I'm a coastal engineer with Moffett Nickel. I'm going to be going over sea level rise projections, and an overview of coastal hazards, which is what we discussed at the first workshop. And then most of this presentation is going to be focused on the results of the vulnerability assessment. And I've got a lot of material. I'm going to click through it somewhat quick, but if you have questions or notes, please jot them down, because we're going to have a lot of time after this in the discussion groups to go over specific questions. What causes sea level rise? There's global and regional factors. The most significant are the global factors. It's as the water column warms, it also expands, and then also the exchange of water stored on land by glaciers and ice sheets into the ocean. There's also local issues, but those are expected to play less of a role in Venice, at least based on the recent history. Before we get into sea level rise, I wanted to recap existing water levels and the natural fluctuations that occur today. So this is kind of a bar chart. Down here we have mean low or low water or low tide. Here is mean sea level, and here is mean higher high water level. So on a daily basis, the tide typically fluctuates in this 5-foot range. Here's an example. This is today's tide chart. High tide was at 8 o'clock this morning, about a 5-foot tide. Low tide at 3 o'clock p.m. is about mean low water. So we have this typical kind of tide range happen today. But a few times a month we get spring tides that are tied to the lunar cycle, and then we get spring tides are up in this range. So rather than 5 feet, we'll be up at 6.5 feet. And then a few times a year we get king tides that are up in the 7-foot range, and then the big El Nino events have additional water level components that result in even higher tides. But the big takeaway is that there's portions of Venice that are really low in elevation, and they're not necessarily the portions on the back of the beach. They're the portions around the canals and that inland area that are actually within the existing tidal range today. And if not for tide gates, which we'll discuss in more detail, they would experience regular flooding. So we looked at 5 different sea level rise scenarios, starting with the baseline of today. And then we looked at 50 centimeter increments. So we went at 1.6 feet, 3.3 feet, 4.9 feet, 6.6 feet. I apologize for the decimals. We would have used nice round numbers in feet, but all of the data we used was made available by the USGS, and they use meters. So we've kind of stuck with these increments. But what we wanted to do is develop even increments that cover the projections out until at least 2100. And sea level rise science is evolving quickly. And what's really going to be changing, or could change, is the timing. When is it going to happen? There's a lot of uncertainty, more and more so as you go further out in the future. So for this sea level rise scenario of 6.6 feet, some of the worst case projections say, it could happen before the end of the century. But you go back and some of the more likely projections have it out past 2200. So there's just a big range that makes planning and engineering things very difficult. So that's part of what this planning process is trying to get their arms around. So when we're talking about coastal hazards in Venice, we're going to be talking about coastal storms and how they impact the existing beach out here. We're going to be talking about erosion, wave action, flooding. And we're also going to be talking about inland low-lying flood areas. Areas around the canal are low in elevation and subject to flooding from the tide gates, also from big rainfall events that need to drain out through the tide gates. So there's, despite the fact that this is, a half mile to a mile from the beach, some of the higher vulnerabilities are going to be in these inland areas, as we'll explain. Here's some photos from the big El Nino events of 1983 that resulted in a lot of damage to the bike path, a lot of beach erosion, damage to the lifeguard headquarters. Here's a more recent picture of large waves at the Venice Pier. As I mentioned, the Cosmos results were released by the United States Geological Survey. They did an assessment of the whole Southern California coast for a whole range of scenarios and sea level rise amounts, and it's the most recent and best available data. So that's what we'll be using for the coastal hazards, the storm and non-storm scenarios. On the inland side, we mapped the flooding potential using the topography and assumed, let's say, a monthly high water level and how far would that flood if the tide gates were left open. And so that simple analysis is what you'll see on a lot of these maps, is the case where the tide gates malfunctioned and we had a spring tide come in and fill up, the low-lying areas. But the tide gates aren't the only source of flooding. There's also an extreme rainfall event could occur, and also coastal flooding from waves overtopping the beach. And the thing with the flooding, what we want to highlight is that regardless of the source of flooding, it's always going to gather at the lowest point. So that's why we're using topography as a good indicator for this inland flooding potential. Here's a couple of photos. This one's looking down Washington Boulevard from the 1983 El Nino. And this is more recently, I believe it's looking toward Grand Canal on 28th Street. And it's a flooding just from a tide gate. They were slow to close the tide gate and tide rose higher than normal. And then this is an elevation map. This is not a flooding map, but it shows existing ground elevations. And the important thing to note is that, starting from the ocean out here, the blue is about mean sea level. Going up into the red and orange, this is 15 to 20 feet above mean sea level. And then we drop back down to close to mean sea level in some areas, through the canals and southeast Venice, and even in the North Venice areas. So these are areas that are really low in elevation today. Much of the area is serviced by pump stations to pump the rainwater out, although a big portion of it does gravity drain to the canals and then out through the tide gates at low tide. This slide is a cartoon depiction of the tide gates and how they work today. So during the dry season, the tides are allowed to rise and fall, but in the canals, they're kept at about mean high water level. There's a little bit higher tide range in the Bayona Lagoon, and they're shut off at mean high water level, so the water doesn't get any higher than that. But the tide range out here in the marina does get up to around 6 or 7 feet, whereas it's held less than 5 feet down here in the canals. And then during the winter, in order to provide some storage for runoff and rainfall, the water level is kept closer down to mean sea level, so that when it rains, the canals can fill up, store that rainwater, and then at low tide, the gates are opened and the floodwater is released into the Marina del Rey channel. So it's sort of a complicated system. There's 2 tide gates. They're operated different in dry weather and wet weather. And the big question is, well, how is sea level rise going to change that? And in dry weather, as the tide rises, there's going to be less opportunity for flushing the water out here using tides. It could be a timing thing. There may just not be enough water exchange, so there could be, most likely the soonest thing is going to be impacts to circulation and possibly poor water quality in the canals. During wet weather, because the groundwater is expected to rise along with sea level, there may be less storage capacity in the canals. So that when we get a big rainfall event, the canals may not be big enough to hold it. And because the tides are higher, it may not be time to drain it before you get the next rainfall event. So there's a threat from just not having enough storage to store the rainwater as well. So what's the vulnerability assessment? What we're trying to do is identify the physical exposure of resources in this area. Now I'm looking at the sensitivity and adaptive capacity of each resource. This informs the local coastal plan by identifying the consequences and then the sea level rise thresholds. What amount of sea level rise is this each impact going to occur, and then approximately what time in the future is that going to be? And then the local coastal plan update will include adaptation strategies to help mitigate the consequences. And we use a three-step process. The first is identifying coastal resources. We use the city databases and augmented with others from different agencies to develop, the different communities of properties, habitat, infrastructure. Then we compare that with the sea level rise exposure maps to figure out, what assets and what resources are exposed. And then we look at each asset individually and determine, how vulnerable are they to sea level rise. So now we're going to get into the map. So these maps are going to show coastal flooding from large events, like El Nino events on the beach here. And they're also going to show inland flooding around the canals. So again, the inland flooding is based on spring high tide if the gates weren't there or if they were to remain open. Even without sea level rise, that type of high tide would flood this area in the canals in the southeast Venice area. With about 1.5 feet of sea level rise, that area grows significantly. So this flooding extends up here and then over to Abbot Kinney and across Venice Boulevard. This is expected to occur, this first scenario we're looking at is between 2040 and 2080 is when the projections say could occur. The next increment is 3.3 feet. So this flooding extends further along Abbot Kinney and then also into the Oxford Triangle up here. And this is projected to occur, earliest is looking at 2060, but I think it's more like the projected value for the end of century. And then you can see out on the beach, this is a scenario where a big coastal flood, big coastal storm during an El Nino combined with 3 feet of sea level rise would result in some flooding back here along the boardwalk. 4.9 feet, the flooding extends across Abbot Kinney along here, and then further up into the Oxford Triangle. And similarly, the coastal flooding we see is down here, still mostly along the back beach and the boardwalk areas. And then the 6.6 foot sea level rise scenario, which isn't expected to occur till out past 2100. This results in significant flooding of the back beach areas and also flooding that extends much further back up here into the canals area. So we looked at 6 different categories of coastal resources and assets. The first I'm going to go over is infrastructure. This looked at the tide gates, wastewater and stormwater collection and pumping systems, transportation, water and power utilities, and then the coastal protection infrastructure. So the most vulnerable areas are, some of these stormwater pumping plants, the Windward Circle, for example, they pump out onto the beach. And today they have issues with sand builds up and blocks the outfall, and it's the county of LA comes out and is supposed to maintain them. But if they don't maintain them enough and that blocks the storm drain, then there's been a few issues where the floodwater backs up. So that's obviously a concern because as sea levels rise, the beach is going to get higher and pushed further landward, probably making that maintenance issue even worse. The tide gates, of course, are critical for flood protection today. They will continue to be critical as sea levels rise. Their operations will be impacted, certainly. There's also the Venice pumping plant and the proposed auxiliary pumping plant, which are critical wastewater pump stations. They're the largest in the city. And they're at risk of flooding from relatively low sea level rise increment. And then the transportation there is, as you can recall from some of the blue areas shaded up here on the canals, there's significant impacts to transportation. We're looking at 8 miles of roadway could be flooded just if the gates malfunction today. And that goes up to 35 miles for the highest sea level rise scenario we looked at. So the exposure is obviously high for a lot of that infrastructure, and the sensitivity of some of it like a storm drain pipe or a tide gate itself is not going to be damaged, but the function it provides could definitely be impaired. So a lot of these are sensitive, whether it's physical damage or whether it's functional damage. There's limited adaptive capacity in these man-made systems. A lot of them have a certain design capacity, and sea level rise is going to push that, and it's likely that they're not going to really be able to adapt without significant repairs or improvements. In the canals area, there could be pump stations increased in size or add more of them to handle the flooding issue, but then that raises challenges with the environmentally sensitive habitat areas in that area and how the pump station is going to cut off tides. So there's a lot of trade-offs that are challenging when we talk about these adaptation strategies. And for some of the pump station facilities and the wastewater treatment plant, it's important to have redundant systems and resiliency built into the design of those facilities. This is just back to the water levels today, and then just highlights we have 8 miles of roadway at this less than 6.5 feet elevation. We have Washington Boulevard head gates, the top of that road there is about 6.7 feet, and then we have the Venice pumping plant at about 7.5 feet. So when we talk about sea level rise, we're talking about this whole bar chart shifting up in elevation, which is going to expose a lot of these to a higher risk of flooding. The next category we looked at was just the impact to property and the number of parcels for each sea level rise scenario. So properties are highly exposed to mostly inland flooding up until a meter or more, or 3 to 6 feet of sea level rises start when the coastal flood areas start to be impacted. A lot of the impacts until then are around the flooding from the canals area. Flooding of this type of area in the property is going to be not only costly but also disrupts the community. And there's limited adaptive capacity other than some sandbags and other floodproofing measures could be implemented, but you need notice to implement those. Like if a rain event's coming, you have time, but if you don't know when the tide gate's going to be left open or fail. I mean, that could be an instantaneous thing. So the adaptive capacity is limited. There's opportunity for upgrading the infrastructure, raising finished floors, but a lot of that's major remodels, and it's key to be thinking about resiliency and emergency planning to deal with these hazards and how to respond and how to recover. So this is a bar chart that just quantifies the impacts to property. This is the number of parcels. So you can see even today there's almost 800 parcels flooded in this inland flooding area, and that increment grows, progressively moving towards Abbot Kinney and across Venice Boulevard as sea levels rise. This chart down here shows by the sub areas, 1,200 homes and 1,000 homes in Southeast Venice and North Venice affected. That is the maximum sea level rise case we looked at, but you can see a lot of the flooding potential of parcels is driven by this inland flooding. And it's not until this high sea level rise scenario that coastal flooding creates a big issue with potential flooding. We also looked at cultural assets. This is from a City of LA database of historic cultural monuments. Some of these most vulnerable includes the Canals District, as we've discussed. It includes also some monuments along Abbot Kinney, like the Venice of America House would be vulnerable to potential flooding with about 1.5 feet of sea level rise. Some of the historic monuments along the coast are a little bit less vulnerable. It's not until 3 to 6 feet of sea level rise that those would be possibly vulnerable to damage from storm events. So similar to the property, a lot of these resources are buildings, and they're going to have a hard time adapting. A further challenge with some of these is it's going to be harder to adapt and protect and preserve the historic character of some of these buildings. You lose the value if you're going to just tear down and rebuild, so that becomes a little more challenging. But again, adaptation strategies that are focused on upgrading the infrastructure and equipping that to prevent this type of flooding are obviously going to help. The civic resources we looked at include bus lines, parking lots, lifeguard, lifeguard services, police and fire, and also elementary schools, the school system in the Venice community. Some of the most vulnerable are the schools, the Westminster School we're at here, and then the West Side Global Magnet School down here near Washington Boulevard is in close proximity to the canals. Both of those are subject to flooding with just 1 to 3 feet of sea level rise. The police station and fire stations, those are have a higher tolerance for sea level rise. The one on the back of the beach is protected by a nice wide beach. The fire station back here is not flooded until some of these higher sea level rise scenarios. The lifeguard headquarters, obviously that's one of the only buildings out there on the beach today, and it's been damaged in the past. It's also, could certainly be vulnerable to more damage with each sea level rise increment. And then there's a lot of disruptions to the bus lines and some of the parking areas with some of the sea level rise hazards. So the highest exposure is to the parking lots, bus lines, and then Westminster Elementary. Sustained flooding in these areas could affect the service of a lot of them. Access to some of the flooded areas is a concern for police and fire. Even though the stations themselves aren't flooded, are they going to be able to get to people that need help if there's substantial flooding in the community? Adaptive capacity, well, the lifeguard towers themselves, those are easy to move. They do that on a seasonal basis, but the bigger headquarters is going to be harder to move. It's going to require significant investment. Similarly, schools and some of these other civic resources it's going to be harder to retrofit and relocate that type of facility. But one of the key things to protect some of the civic resources is emergency planning, so that the key services are available and they're prepared for these types of events and hazards, and also infrastructure upgrades again. The coastal amenities we looked at is the recreational facilities around the Venice Beach, the boardwalk area, the pier, the Oakwood Recreation Center, and then just beach recreation in general. So the Venice boardwalk is due to the nice wide beaches, is not vulnerable until an extreme storm event combined with 3 feet of sea level rise. There is portions like the skate park and some of these other facilities that are further out there on the beach could be exposed sooner than that. And a lot of it depends on the effect of the breakwater. As sea levels rise, how effective is the breakwater going to be at retaining the sand that's behind it today? And how will that breakwater be adapted, if at all, in the future? The Venice fishing pier has been damaged by large wave events in the past. That's an important amenity that provides low-cost access and opportunities for the community. And then beach recreation in general, just the dry beach area will be reduced with sea level rise, especially with some of the higher sea level rise amounts could start to impact the recreational opportunity, the tourism draw that the beach provides. So some of the beach areas we discussed could erode 50 feet in the short term to over 300 feet, which is about half the beach in some of the wider areas. A lot of the beachfront amenities aren't vulnerable till 3 feet of sea level rise combined with a large storm event, which is not until 2060 to 2100 time frame. Some of the facilities are sensitive to chronic erosion, but maybe not necessarily flooding. Like the skate park could flood and it could still be fine. It just needs to dry out. But other facilities, if they're undermined by erosion, it's obviously going to be permanent damage. Some opportunities for adaptive capacity of these facilities would be a beach nourishment program in the future, or some coastal dunes to kind of improve the capability of these facilities to weather a big El Nino event or coastal storm. Like a living shoreline dunes project or other measures aimed at just improving the resiliency and ability to recover from some of these events would be good adaptation strategies for these amenities. We looked at ecological, using some of the map data around the sandy beach habitat. There's a few least-term nesting areas down by the Marina del Rey Channel. There's the Bayona Lagoon Marsh Preserve, the canals habitat area, and then rocky nesting around the breakwaters. So some of the most vulnerable areas are the canals area and the Bayona Lagoon. because it is a managed system today, but at least they get some tidal variation. Once the sea levels rise enough, that tidal range is going to become more and more limited, and it's going to be impacting water quality and the diversity of species. And then the impacts to the sandy beach, long-term erosion is expected to occur and could start infringing upon some of the fenced-off areas down there for lease term. The beach erosion in general is pretty significant, especially over this long-term time horizon. Water quality and tidal flow are key issues. The endangered species in for the plover are obviously very sensitive to this type of habitat loss. The plant species in the canals in the Bayonne Lagoon, they don't have a lot of place to migrate, so they are going to be very sensitive. There's going to be a lot of changes impacting that habitat. Some of the opportunities for adaptive capacity, well, it's limited in the canals, but perhaps it can be restored elsewhere as a separate project. The large beach area does provide opportunity for reconfiguration of some of those protected nesting areas. So that concludes the vulnerability assessment. I'm going to give it back to Joan.
Great, thank you, Aaron. We know there was a lot of information, and so we're quickly going to go to the groups. And like I said, at each group, we will have a project team member and a facilitator. And know that all the project team members who are going to be with the groups are all working on this on a day-to-day basis and are immersed in the material. So Aaron was the team spokesperson, but everyone you're going to meet from Dudek and Moffett and Nickel is well equipped to address your questions. And did you have a question about the process, sir?
I have one general question. I know that the Marina Del Rey is in the county, and you exclude it from everything that you have on there. Is it excluded because it's in the county, or is it excluded because it's not affected by the rise of the oceans?
Do you want to answer that quickly, and then we'll move on?
It's a little of both. It is outside of the City of LA boundary, so it's excluded from the study because of that, but it is also higher in elevation. If we can look at the elevation map, the areas are built up around the marina. So,
that's why I understand.
Yeah.
Because every time you look at it, it's not there. Because it's saying it's not being affected by anything.
But the flooding doesn't affect the community. So we would have shown the flooding if it did flood, I guess.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
So before I talk about the process and how we get to these groups, I want to go to the last slide because there's a lot of important information on, it's actually our wrap-up slide, but I want to make sure that all of you get that information. And we'll probably be in the discussion groups up until close to the end of the workshop this evening until about 9 o'clock. So, whoops. Okay, here we go. So we want you to know that on the Venice LCP website that the city hosts, the presentation will be posted, and also the input card that or a survey with the same questions is going to be posted. So if you know people who didn't have a chance to be here this evening, but they're interested in the material and they want to provide some input, have them go to the website, and that should be posted. I'm looking for Helen in like a couple of days. Yeah, in a couple of days. So we want you to know that. Next steps include finalizing the vulnerability assessment. So the questions that we hear from you this evening are going to be important for the team as they finalize the analysis. There may be input from you, questions, comments that they hadn't considered. And so they'll be looking at what do you have to say tonight as they finalize it. We're going to be having another community workshop, and I hope all of you attend as well as more in a few months. And the purpose of that workshop will be to come back and present draft adaptation strategies to the community, and then importantly to hear your feedback on those strategies before they become more detailed. And of course, there is the website address is there. So I want to make sure to go over that information before we go into the small groups. So I'm going to go back now. Here's the way this is going to work. Each of you has a number on your name tag. It's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. And if you see the tables, they're marked 1, 2, 3, and then 4, 5, and 6. And so when we break, you'll go to your table. And like I said before, you'll be able to sit, get comfortable, and about every 20 minutes, you're going to get a new team for your group. And the teams are focused on 3 different topics. So all of the different topics that Aaron talked about in his presentation are going to be, they're encompassed in these 3 categories. So one of the teams is going to be focused on infrastructure and civic assets, one on property assets, and one on coastal amenities, cultural, and ecological assets. So when you're sitting in your table, you will get to discuss all 3 of those categories as the different project teams rotate to your table. And I want to let the facilitators know that because we're all going to be on the same timeline, I'm going to use the microphone to give you a 5-minute update or 5-minute warning on your Q&A, and then a 2-minute warning. And then I'll call the time when it's time to rotate. And let's see, I want to make sure everyone knows we have refreshments in the back. So in case you missed dinner, we don't want you to be hungry during this important part of the workshop. So grab a snack. And then we just have some tips for productive discussions. We want to make sure that everyone here gets a chance to participate in the groups and have their questions voiced and answered. So please let one person speak at a time. It's up to everyone here to make sure that everyone has a chance to provide input and gets equal time. Keep your input concise so that others do have a chance to participate. Actively listen to others and try on their perspective and for understanding. And offer ideas to address questions or when people are asking questions, that might lead to new questions in your mind too. So be open to that. So I'm going to go back to our process slide. And have I forgotten anything, facilitators? Okay, you guys are ready, I can tell. All right, so go to your groups.